we're seeing their learning style become more visual. They're used to consuming visual and video content. Think TikTok and YouTube. We've passed the peak saturation point of technology, and now we've got, from a consumer perspective, people saying, I want to use technology to control technology. The only way we can see wages rise is if productivity rises. But the challenge is that workers today are saying, well, I don't want to work harder. I don't want to work longer. I want work-life balance. The work participation is, for many people, at its limits. We've got the rise of the middle class, increasing expectations of what we look for in lifestyle. Demand for housing is greater than supply. Demand for infrastructure and public transport and energy provision is greater than supply. And of course, there is diversity within a generation. The previous generation, millennials, were definitely tech optimists, and they embrace technology. The new parents of today are more tech skeptics.
Hello and welcome. You're tuned into Mint, and today we're joined by a very special guest, Mr. Mark McCrindle. He's a researcher, he's an author, he's a TEDx speaker, and most importantly, he's most known for coining the term Gen Alpha. Thank you so much, Mr. McCrindle, for joining us here today.
Well, thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Right. Well, the one word that I think was buzzing throughout the first week of January as we start 2025 is the fact that this is the start of Generation Beta, right? Gen Beta, even as we're still sort of coming to terms with the fact that millennials are refusing to believe that they're growing older. We still think that Gen Z are the kids here, but now we've kind of skipped 2 generations ahead. So could you start off by telling us what exactly is Gen Beta and what will their characteristics be?
Well, we're talking about the generation born from this year, so 2025 through to 2039, with each of the generations now spanning 15 years of births. So they're largely the children of Generation Z. Having worked their way through the alphabet, we got to Generation Z. That comprises their parents. That is the generation slightly younger than the millennials that you just mentioned, because Generation Z at the oldest age are now turning 30, which is right in the peak fertility years in most countries. And so their children are Generation Beta. There's about 2.5 million betas born every week in the world, and they'll end up comprising about 2 billion people globally. So a pretty large generation in terms of total births. Most of them will live into the 22nd century. For some of us, it doesn't seem like that long ago that we welcomed in this 21st century, but there you go. They'll live, and indeed many will be working into the 22nd century as well. And so a world of AI and technology and productivity through devices and tools and wearables, that defines something of their future and the world that they will inherit and shape.
Right, absolutely. So, could you tell us maybe some characteristics that these kids are likely to have? Of course, they will grow up, as you said, in a world which is full of technology. They'll be born into AI. So, how would this shape their worldview and sort of what they do?
Well, firstly, because of that technology saturation, we're seeing their learning style become more visual. They're used to consuming visual and video content. Think TikTok and YouTube and Instagram for that matter. They're influenced not just by what the experts or authority figures say, but what the peer groups say. So it's the social as well as the digital for this generation that is visual. That tells us something of their future. Mobile also defines them in terms of where they'll work. We've seen the decoupling of work from location, more flexibility in a knowledge economy to work remotely, to telework or work from home, and indeed to study from home. They won't have to necessarily physically relocate to work in another country or study in another country. They can do that from anywhere, but they will be more mobile in terms of where they travel as well, with global travel and decreasing costs of that, really opening up this world for this globally connected generation. And so, those factors brought about by technology and the shaping of them will be key to them. Other things I would say is that they will be the most formally educated generation in history because they're beginning education earlier, they're staying in education longer. Many of them right around the world going on to tertiary studies. It's not the exception, it's now normative to complete their high schooling and go into further study. They will live longer than the previous generations. We're seeing life expectancy increase right around the world, and they're the most materially endowed generation in history. In fact, they're growing up in this amazing time where the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty is at the lowest rate recorded. And so the most materially endowed, technologically supplied, formally educated, and indeed with the longest life expectancy of any generation, a lot of positives for them as they begin their lives.
Absolutely. And what would you say is probably the one biggest difference that we'll see between Gen Alpha and Gen Beta? Because even Gen Alpha, of course, they were not born into AI, but a lot of these technologies have come up while they are growing up, right? So, what would you say is the one biggest difference that we'll see between the two generations?
It would have to be the parents. It's too early to exactly know how Generation Beta will be like and what their attitudes will be like, but we do know a lot about how they will be shaped because of their parents. Now, the parents of Generation Alpha are the millennials, and they certainly had technology as well, but they weren't shaped in it from the youngest age. But the parents of Generation Beta are Generation Z, and they have grown up in a world of technology. That 15-year difference being shaped in the 90s and early 2000s for the Gen Zs was quite different to growing up in the 80s for the generation that went before the millennials. So the parents of today are the first generation of parents who have grown up in the world of devices. With the iPhone, with tablets, with the social media as mainstream. And therefore, technology for them is not a novelty. It's something that needs to be managed or controlled. The parents of today, the previous generation, millennials, were definitely tech optimists, and they embrace technology. The new parents of today are more tech skeptics. They see the downside of social media, screen time, sedentary lives, and addictive behavior of those devices. Therefore, they're going to be more controlling of the devices when it comes to parenting and their children. So for the first time, we're going to see a generation who don't give those children technologies thinking that it's a future of robotics and automation, and the more they get familiar with technology, the better, but rather will dial that technology down, will limit the exposure that their children have to technology, just delay getting their own devices a little bit longer so that their children, these Gen Betas, can grow up not just with technology skills, but life skills and people skills and confident to interact without a screen. That's a big change we will see. So technology is going to be managed. It's going to have guide rails around it, and it's going to be used to help educate and facilitate this generation, but it won't be a free-for-all digital saturation like we saw for the Generation Alphas.
Okay, so now I just want to sort of dive a little deeper into these labels. Like, why did we come up with these 15-year time spans for the generations? Because I think earlier the a generation used to be much longer than what we consider one now. So, what is the reason for this difference, and how did you come up with the term Gen Alpha?
Hmm. Yeah, well, we have put forward for some decades, and I've been in this field studying as a social researcher the emerging generations now for more than 20 years. And, the baby boomers, probably the original generation that had a label, they span 18 years, which is getting a bit long to think of all of the people born in that period to be of the one cohort. But if we get shorter and shorter, you end up with too many generations that it becomes meaningless. So we decided on 15 years as the fair balance for that. Let's give labels more in the scientific category or nomenclature. Because if we just give a label based on a popular culture event or a new technology, it's not going to carry the weight over time. Let's allow the generation to create their own meaning as to what that label is embodying. There's infrastructure investments, there's legislative processes going in place in all countries where they're thinking about what will the 2050s will be like, or planning a city for the 2060s. And we know who will inhabit those cities. We can work out the demographics, and we know the generations, whether it be the alphas, the betas, or the ones coming from 2040 to 2055, which would be generation gamma. It allows for forward planning. It allows for comparisons across these 15-year spans of time, so generational assessment, and it allows a clear labeling system so we know historically which generation we're referring to.
Right. Well, I think you pretty much answered my next question, which was that what would your message be to critics of these labels who say that they're basically just labels, they don't really have any importance. But even so, if you had like one line to sort of speak back to them, what would your response be to that?
Well, it's important to acknowledge that, of course, there is diversity within a generation. We can't think that all of these 2 billion generation beaters globally will be of one mind, will be the same, because culture has an impact, country of birth has an impact, gender and background and socioeconomics and religion and worldview and parenting. All of that has an impact and makes us diverse individuals. But if we want to understand populations, we have to understand groups and we have to do some segmentation. Now, we can look at socioeconomics or culture or background or religion, but we find one of the best first places to start is understanding generations. Yes, there is difference within a generation, and there are, of course, similarities across generations. But if we can understand some of the unique factors of a generation, and one of those factors is life stage, a generation shares a similar life stage or age. That's what makes a generation. Secondly, the times that have shaped them are shared. We might have all been teenagers, but we weren't all teenagers in the 2020s, as is the case now for Generation Alpha. We weren't all coming of age, beginning our lives in the third decade of the 21st century, as Generation Beta are finding. So the age, the circumstances of our shaping, the events, the technologies, all leave fingerprints on us. We call them social markers when we experience these things in our formative years. And that, of course, is different for each generation and gives a similar sense of shared experience within a generation, but separates each generation from the ones that went before. And while, of course, a Generation Beta growing up in Bangalore, India is going to be different from a Generation Beta growing up in Sydney, Australia, each of these two youngsters are closer together than their parents or their grandparents ever were. In other words, there is cultural convergence around the world, particularly through technology, and that's what shapes Generation Beta, part of a global culture, a technological era, and this 21st century. And that's why here we are talking, across the planet from Australia to India, because there's an interest in this global generation. So yes, there's differences, of course, as humans, all those individual differences, but the generations allow us to understand the similarities and allow us to bridge gaps across generations. And I think that's important for our communities.
So, what would you say are the five big trends that are likely to emerge in this year that people should watch out for?
Well, the first is we calling big build, where the growth of our world is such, the demographic growth, that now we're starting to see some shortfalls. Demand for housing is greater than supply. Demand for infrastructure and public transport and energy provision is greater than supply. And this is true right around the world. We're playing a bit of catch up because we've just been through the biggest birth numbers in the globe's history. We're starting to plateau now. Those birth rates are slowing, and even the birth numbers over the decade ahead will slow. But ensuring the infrastructure is there for the largest planetary sort of population we've ever had, but the largest annual population increase as well is important. Particularly, as I said, we've got the rise of the middle class, increasing expectations of what we look for in lifestyle, and that requires, with population growth, to have infrastructure growth and provision. The second is what I call the productivity paradox, that right around the world, businesses, organizations, economies are looking to increase their productivity so that they can grow that wealth and share that wealth with their citizens. The only way we can see wages rise is if productivity rises. That's true of a small business, and it's true of an economy. But the challenge is that workers today are saying, well, I don't want to work harder. I don't want to work longer. I want work-life balance. I want well-being. I want mental health. I want time with family. And so while productivity is a real goal, the work participation is, for many people, at its limits. And so the only way to maximize productivity and yet not further increase, if you like, the time at work or the depth of that work is to utilize technology, AI, for productivity purposes. So I think increasingly we will see that as a focus for the rest of this decade. A third factor we're looking at from a consumer perspective, we're calling consumer compromise. We've seen over the last decade consumers focus particularly on buying products or from brands that have clear environmental credentials, that are about sustainability, that are about fair trade. Consumers want to buy local and support their local economy or their national economy. But at the same time, we've got a real cost of living crisis globally, inflation and price challenges. And so consumers are now saying, look, I want to buy virtuously, but actually the price is driving the decision. And they're not prepared to pay more for anything from energy through to consumer products, even though it might have green credentials, if the price is higher than what is otherwise available. Because consumers are getting smart with managing their household budgets, and they're buying not just from values, but from value. Therefore, the consumer compromise is buying smart and ensuring the brands provide the right credentials, the environmental sustainability, but not charge more for it. The fourth of these trends is digital detox. And that flows from what I was sharing earlier, that we've got a new generation of parents that are seeing not only the benefits of technology, but the downsides. And that's true for all of us as adults as well. And we're seeing people recognize that they need to perhaps limit the time on devices, not further increase it. We've passed the peak saturation point of technology. And now we've got, from a consumer perspective, people saying, I want to use technology to control technology. I want to have a digital detox. I want to enjoy the outdoors and friends, not just connect through a device.